A dark evening had fallen on the city, and the rain was pounding the pavement harder and harder, as if obeying the gloomy atmosphere. Jamal walked down the narrow street, taking his time, but knowing that soon he would have to turn into an alley and pass the warehouse where a major robbery had taken place a few days ago. He was far from the only one passing through here. The neighborhood was crowded, and the streets were filled with the hum of machinery and the laughter of passers-by. But in that moment, Jamal sensed that something in the air wasn't right. A sense of unease clouded his mind, and his intuition told him that tonight he would not be just a passer-by. As Jamal passed the corner house, his gaze fell on a police patrol parked at the edge of the road. There was a moment of confusion, and then 2 officers stepped out of the car and headed toward him. Their steps were sure, with a kind of ominous calm, as if they'd been waiting a long time for this moment. He felt his chest constrict. He always felt helpless in a situation like this. He didn't know why, but his heart beat faster. "Hey, you!" one of the policemen called loudly, a tall man with a tense expression on his face. Jamal stopped, not sure what was going on. "We're looking for you." He looked around, trying to figure out what was wrong. There were only a few people around, but there was no reason for him to be stopped on the streets. He was used to being noticed just because of the color of his skin, but this time something was especially heavy in their stares. He tried to remain calm, but panic was starting to build inside. "What's the matter?" he asked, trying not to show his nervousness. His voice trembled, but he pulled himself together. "You were seen near the crime scene," said the second policeman, middle-aged with a tired expression, but his eyes were as sharp as a knife blade. "We saw you walking near that warehouse. Do you even know what happened there?" Jamal knew there had been a recent robbery at the warehouse, but he couldn't understand why he was among the suspects. He wasn't there when the crime was committed. He was just passing by when they saw him. "I don't know anything about it," Jamal said, trying to sound confident. "I was just walking home." "You weren't there, were you?" one of the policemen asked, not hiding the mockery in his voice. "Maybe you're the guy who took all this stuff?" Jamal looked at him sharply. His words were full of contempt, and his gaze was as cold as metal. He could feel them sizing him up, looking at him like a criminal just because he was black. He knew that. He knew that to them, he was just one of those typical criminals they catch on the street every day. His body tensed and his heart beat even faster. This wasn't just a detention. This was a trap. The policeman continued to speak, his voice growing harsher. "You're in such a hurry to get home that you didn't even hear what happened next door? Where are your friends, Jamal? You didn't come here alone, did you?" Jamal opened his mouth to reply, but something about the way they stood around him kept him from speaking. This wasn't an investigation. This was a cruel game in which no one was going to listen to him. He was already guilty in their eyes, no matter what really happened. Suddenly, before he could react, one of the policemen grabbed him by the shoulder and shoved him hard. Jamal staggered, not expecting such aggression. "You don't know what we're talking about, do you?" growled the one holding him. "You were there. You could have done it. You're just like everybody else, so you got caught." This moment was a moment that always came in his life, but always avoided. He saw it in the faces of the men who feared him, and in the eyes full of contempt. He knew they would not leave him alone until they were convinced he was a criminal. Jamal felt himself being pulled into this nightmare. His silence had become his only weapon, but that weapon wasn't saving him. The same policeman pushed him forward, and he found himself in their car. The walls of the car were close and pressing in like a curse. But there was one feeling that stayed in his chest like a hoop. He knew they didn't just suspect him. They had already passed judgment, and that sentence wasn't about what he'd done. It was about who he was. When the door closed, the sound of the lock, as if to drown out everything else, left Jamal in complete silence. He was in a small room with dim light that barely made it through the dirty windows. But the shadow looming over him was much darker. He was seated at a desk opposite, a pulled-down, old leather chair on which sat Johnson, the detective, with a face full of confidence and contempt. Jamal knew his fate was in the hands of this man, but for a moment, in a room full of brutal silence, he felt something inside him break. Not his will, but something else that made his heart beat faster. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was facing more than just an interrogation. It was more than that. A fight to the last drop of strength, even if he didn't know how it would end. "So, Jamal," Johnson said, his lips curling slightly. His voice was dry as sand. "Tell me why you were near the crime scene. You haven't explained that. Why do we see you there?" Jamal raised his head and met the detective's gaze. He felt the heat rising in his chest, but he had to answer calmly. He knew that every word, every movement would be used against him. "I don't know anything about the crime," he answered calmly. "I was just walking down the street." Johnson grinned. It wasn't a chuckle, but a grin, like a predator ready to attack. "You're not the first person to say that, are you? Did you think you could just walk by like an invisible man?" Johnson's voice grew increasingly mocking. People like you, are always around when something dirty happens, and then you disappear. Don't you think we know who you are?" Jamal felt his chest grow heavy. Those words cut like a knife into his heart, but he wouldn't let himself give up. He'd seen it before, seen it in the eyes of people who looked at him, knowing nothing but seeing only his skin. He was guilty from the beginning, precisely because he was black. "Are you saying that I'm involved in this case just because I'm passing through?" he said with restraint, though his insides clenched with rage. Johnson stood opposite without averting his gaze. He was tall, with a square face that reflected the inexorability of power. But behind that expression was fear. Fear that Jamal might be the one to break free. It intensified his aggression. "Do you even realize who you are?" The detective spoke, leaning forward. His voice became cold and hard. "Do you think people like you can be innocent? You're just another gangster who's always involved in crime but finds a way to hide. And you think it's going to be hard for us to catch you?" Jamal was silent. With each word Johnson spoke, the room grew hotter and hotter, the air saturated with electricity like the eve of a thunderstorm. He could feel his skin burning with pain, but he couldn't give up. He knew that to give up was to lose, and not just to himself. He would lose to everyone who had ever believed he wasn't. "Don't you realize why you're here?" Johnson continued, no longer hiding his contempt. "We can make you confess. You're a black man, you know that. We've known your kind for a long time. You probably think your silence means something, don't you? That it's going to help you?" Jamal closed his eyes for a moment. He felt his hands begin to tremble, but he didn't let himself let his fear get the best of him. His life had long been full of pain, fear, and humiliation. He knew that to people like Johnson, he would always be guilty, even if he hadn't done anything. "I don't know what you want to hear," he said, opening his eyes and looking firmly into the detective's eyes. "I'm not a criminal." Johnson jumped up from his chair, his face contorted in rage. He stepped closer, his breathing becoming heavy and hot. You're going to say you're innocent again," he roared, so that Jamal felt the air around him grow even more tense. "People like you can't be innocent. You're always involved in something. You can't escape it, damn you." With every word he said, Jamal felt a powerful torrent of rage building up inside him. But he restrained himself. He knew it wasn't just a cop sitting on the other side of the table. On the other side was the entire world that knew him only by his appearance and racial stereotypes. Johnson was just the embodiment of that world, a world in which he could never be just an ordinary man. Jamal rose from the table, never taking his eyes off the detective. This wasn't just impertinence. It was his last chance at freedom. He wasn't going to apologize for what he'd been. "I'm not a criminal, Johnson," he said firmly, feeling with each word the strength in his voice that he thought he'd lost. "But you seem to have already decided what I am, just by the way I look." Something cruel flashed in Johnson's eyes, and he went back to the table. His hand clenched into a fist, but before he could do anything, the door opened. A uniformed sergeant stepped into the room, and Johnson froze in place. "We'll talk again," he said, the fury in his voice unconcealed. "You, Jamal, will pay for your words." Jamal felt a twinge of pain grip him, but he knew in that moment, despite the threats and humiliation, he had won one small battle. Had not given up, and that was all he had. Before we continue, let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from, whether you've had something similar in your life or whether you've encountered something that affected you just as deeply. Also, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new chapters. And now, we continue. Jamal was sitting in the dimly lit room when the door opened again. Johnson stepped forward, his face like a clenched fist, full of contempt. He looked at Jamal like something pathetic and without value, like something that couldn't just be ignored. His eyes were cold, without the slightest trace of doubt. This wasn't just an interrogation. This was a game in which Jamal was just a pawn. Johnson walked over to the desk and with a thud placed in front of Jamal the documents he knew Jamal would use against him. But at that moment it was clear that for Johnson it wasn't about what he would find, it was about what he would do with Jamal. He had made up his mind long ago, and everything that was happening now was just part of a game that Jamal had been guilty of from the start. This wasn't an investigation. This was personal revenge. Revenge for his race, for his skin, for the fact that Johnson saw him as a typical criminal. "You do realize you're not here by accident, right?" Johnson began, his voice tinged with sarcasm. "You probably thought you could get away with it. But you don't know how things work in our world, do you?" He spoke softly, but every syllable was full of hatred. "I've known your kind for a long time. You and your friends. You're always there when something happens. And you can't hide. You're just one of those people who always end up on the wrong side of the law." Jamal didn't know what to say. These words were not new to him. He had heard them before, from people who saw him only as a dark figure in a crowd, not as a living person with a history. They saw him as a danger only because of his skin color. Johnson was just such a person. He was one of those who believed that every black man was a criminal waiting to happen. "Do you even realize who you are?" Johnson continued, moving closer to the table. He leaned toward Jamal, his breath smelling of tobacco and alcohol. "You're a black man. You can't be innocent. Your skin speaks for itself. We see people like you every day. You probably think you're going to walk out of here with a clean conscience. But I'm sure you already knew you'd end up here one day. You're just like everyone else." Jamal felt the muscles in his chest tighten. Every breath he took was like a struggle. He knew that anything he said would only complicate the situation. It had always been like this in his life. He and his friends were always to blame in other people's eyes. Even if they didn't do anything, they were just perceived as a threat. Everything they said turned them in because their appearance was already a verdict. "I didn't do anything, Johnson," Jamal said, his voice barely audible but firm. "I'm not a criminal." "Are you serious?" Johnson chuckled, his laugh cold and hard. "You expect me to believe what you say? We learned to read people like you a long time ago. You see how everyone around you is. Your friends are criminals. Your culture is a crime. You're all like that, Jamal. You're part of this world. And no matter how much you fight back, you can't escape. It's no longer a matter of evidence. It's a matter of how we perceive you, people like you." He continued as if he didn't hear Jamal's answers, as if his words didn't need a response. It wasn't just aggression. It was a system designed to destroy anything that might give Jamal hope. Johnson was the epitome of the racism that permeated the entire structure of law enforcement, and it was all directed against Jamal to break him. "Do you think your life matters? That your silence can make a difference?" Johnson leaned in so close to him that Jamal could feel his breath on his face. "You're just one of those people who live in a world where you're always guilty because you're just like everyone else. And you can never prove that you're not a criminal. We will always look at you the way we see you. You can't hide from that." A silent but powerful wave of rage swept through Jamal's body. He was here not because he had committed a crime, but because his existence was threatened. Johnson and everyone else who shared his views saw him as nothing more than a typical black male who could be anything but a criminal. It wasn't a matter of evidence. It was more than an accusation. It was a whole system that forced him to pay for who he was, even if his hands were clean. But Jamal already knew that surrender was not an option. He couldn't and didn't want to be another victim of this system. And even if his words couldn't change the situation, he was ready to resist to the end. "I'm not a criminal, Johnson," he said quietly, but with such decision that his every word sounded like a sentence to the detective himself. Johnson was silent for a moment, his gaze darkening, but he did not answer. He knew he would not be easily broken in this case. But Jamal was ready to fight. For himself, for his life, for his truth, which could not be drowned out by cruel words or racist attitudes. The police officers, who did not share Johnson's aggressive views, proceeded with caution, but it was clear to them that Jamal's case needed attention. They were in an apartment that was far from what they had expected. The quality of life in the neighborhood where Jamal lived was low, but the apartment they were looking around was unlike anything they had seen before in places like this. It was neat and even somewhat refined. The oddities didn't end there, however. One of the policemen, Detective Chief Inspector Mason, noted this at once, but he did not say it out loud. He sensed that something was wrong, but he couldn't figure out what it was. He went to the closet, and as he opened it, his eyes widened visibly. "Look what we have here," Mason said to his partner, Jenkins, beckoning him over. Jenkins approached, and as he looked at the items hidden in the closet, his face expressed displeasure, but he could not hide his curiosity either. In the closet, among the ordinary clothes, they found boxes of antique jewelry, rare rings, jewelry that seemed too valuable for someone living in this neighborhood. These things clearly did not belong to the average laborer. But that was just the beginning. While Jenkins was looking at the jewelry, Mason noticed several books stacked neatly on one of the shelves. They were old tomes about collecting antiques and rare editions that cost a fortune. Next up were even stranger finds. Several photographs that showed Jamal in the company of known criminals, several people whose names were on the rumor in the criminal world. At first, it seemed random, but the more they looked, the stronger the feeling became that they had stumbled upon something more. "Who is he really?" Jenkins asked, his voice sounding puzzled. "Why would he have such a thing?" Mason thought for a moment, scrutinizing the photographs. He realized that this evidence wouldn't just change the course of the investigation, it would call into question everything they knew about Jamal. His suspicions began to deepen. These things were too valuable and too specific for someone who worked in a warehouse. And, more strangely, his ties to the underworld they'd seen in these photos didn't fit the image of a simple working guy. Jamal seemed too quiet, too inconspicuous to be part of such a world. "We have to tell Johnson about this," Jenkins said, still not believing his eyes. But Mason was no longer sure. Johnson was too determined to see anything but suspicion behind it. He wouldn't have heard of such findings. He would have only reinforced his accusations against Jamal based on his racial preconceptions. And what if Jamal was something more than they had assumed? What if he was part of something much more complex? Mason remembered how Johnson had treated Jamal, how his bias had made the guy the perfect culprit without any evidence. At that moment, Mason realized that he needed to approach this case carefully, need to get to the bottom of what they found before blaming Jamal. As Mason and Jenkins continued to explore the apartment, their attention was drawn to several other papers hidden among the books. They were old papers, clearly belonging to several unknown people, among them names that would not be found in such documents of an ordinary person. They could have been connections to antiques groups, to the underworld, or it could have been something more dangerous than simple theft. "We have to show this to the chief," Mason finally said, but his voice sounded uncertain. "This is beyond the realm of ordinary theft." He felt that every step in this investigation was getting darker and darker. Some of the cops were beginning to wonder if Jamal was just a pawn in some game that was more complicated than they realized. Meanwhile, in the interrogation room, Johnson continued his aggressive game with Jamal, and each of his lines became more personal, more violent. He was sure that, despite all these findings, Jamal was part of something much darker. He could feel his tension rising with each passing moment. He was ready for any turn of events, but this time he had no clear evidence. What if Jamal really was involved in these crimes? Or perhaps he was part of something much more dangerous. This wasn't just a theft case. It was an investigation that could take a completely unexpected direction. Mason and Jenkins, having left the room with those very findings, knew their next move would be crucial. But before they could report it to Johnson, they had to figure out exactly who Jamal really was. Mason couldn't shake the feeling that they were only touching the surface of what Jamal was hiding. Each new find, each item they uncovered in his apartment gave more and more reason for doubt. Strange jewelry, books that couldn't have belonged to a simple worker, pictures of criminals, all pointed to more than just theft. He felt that they were already far from a normal investigation, and the feeling grew stronger by the hour. Jamal, who seemed like a regular guy, turned out to be a much more complex figure. Mason turned to his partner Jenkins, who continued to examine the paperwork. "Look at this," Jenkins said, showing another envelope hidden in the books. "It's not just evidence. It's a direct indication of connections to criminal groups." The envelope, hidden among the old antiquarian books, contained a set of documents listing the names, addresses, and phone numbers of people familiar with major criminal groups. All of them had connections to the underworld that the police had encountered on more than one occasion. Some of the names were familiar, dangerous people involved in the arms and drug trade, and all of them had crossed paths with Jamal in some way. Mason turned the page, and his gaze fell on a photo of Jamal standing next to one of the city's most notorious thieves and arms dealers, Clint Harris. Their eyes stared directly into the camera, and it wasn't just a meeting between two casual acquaintances. It was more than that. Something was connected between them, but no one could yet figure out what it was. "He's not just a thief," Mason said, his voice heavy with realization. "He's some kind of connecting element. It's much deeper than it seems." Jenkins frowned and began to read another document. It was full of numbers, addresses, and codes that apparently meant something the regular cops didn't know. This set of information could be a clue to not only who Jamal was, but what he was hiding. Mason could feel his anxiety growing. With each new discovery in Jamal's apartment, their suspicions grew more and more serious. This guy wasn't just a victim of circumstance. He was far more dangerous than they realized. He was connected to people who weren't just breaking the law, they were part of an entire criminal network, and his silence, his confidence under questioning, wasn't just calm. It was a knowledge that none of them could understand. As Jenkins continued to examine the documents, Mason found himself thinking more and more about how deeply rooted racism was in the case. Johnson was too set against Jamal to see what lay beyond his preconceived accusations. He was convinced that Jamal was guilty because he was black, and no matter how circumstances changed, Johnson probably wouldn't have seen the truth unless it was obvious and under his nose. "You and I know Johnson will never believe it," Jenkins said, glancing at Mason. He'd still see it as confirmation of his theories. But what if Jamal was actually involved in something bigger, in some kind of network we can't even imagine? Mason glanced at the photographs spread out on the table, at the antique jewelry and documents that seemed to belong to the underworld itself. As much as Johnson wanted to believe his side of the story, the evidence was beginning to tell a different story. He began to question whether Johnson was limiting his investigation to racial bias. Jamal was just part of something much more complex and dangerous. "This is much more serious than we thought," Mason said, walking over to the table and looking at another document. "He's really connected to this world. But what does it mean for us? For the investigation?" Jenkins stepped away from the table and looked out the window. He knew Jamal was more than just a theft suspect. This evidence, these connections to criminals, all pointed to someone who played a role in a larger, violent, and dangerous business. He wasn't just a thief, he was a link. His life was intertwined with those who left traces in the darkest corners of the city. "We have to be careful," Jenkins said, turning his attention back to the documents. "If this is true, if he's really connected to people like Harris, then we need to proceed with the utmost caution. We may not even realize how high up those connections go." Meanwhile, Johnson continued his fight with Jamal. With each new day, he became more and more aggressive, leaving no room for doubt that he was right. But what if all his confidence was based on false beliefs? What if he was so absorbed in his racist gaze that he couldn't see what was right in front of him? Mason and Jenkins realized they were facing something far more dangerous. Jamal wasn't just a theft suspect. He was part of something that could affect not only their investigation, but the entire city. What they found in his apartment called into question all of their previous conclusions. And the further they went, the clearer one important question became. Who was Jamal really, and what dangerous people were behind his silence? They knew one thing. This investigation was not limited to simple theft. It involved those who were willing to go to any lengths to maintain their power and cover up their crimes. And if they weren't careful, if they couldn't uncover all the connections, Jamal could be just the tip of the iceberg in a web that was impossible to get out of. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from and whether you had something similar in your life. Share your opinions and experiences. Also, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss exciting new chapters. And now we continue. As the door closed behind him and he found himself back in the dark, empty room, Jamal felt his life slipping back to the brink. He sat in this cage, not only physically but mentally, realizing that his past and present were intertwined in such a way that it had become impossible to escape. He always knew that in the world where he grew up, his every action, every word, and every movement was in the crosshairs. He was black, and therefore guilty by default. There was no room for doubt in this world. Jamal grew up in a neighborhood where laws ruled. He knew that if you were born in this land, it would not be easy. From childhood, he learned to be strong, silent, constantly balancing on the edge between what seemed acceptable and what was strictly forbidden. He saw his siblings, parents, and neighbors lose their fight against the system, and every day became a new challenge for him. He remembered how, as a child, when his mother had tried to get a job, she'd been turned down every time without giving a reason, but he knew it wasn't an accident. Her dark skin and accent, though slight, had been an obstacle for them. She had tried to explain to Jamal that the world wasn't fair, that they would always look at them with suspicion. But despite everything, she always found the strength to get up and move on. He taught himself the same thing, to live in an environment where all your mistakes, your steps, can be decisive. Jamal's life has always been a struggle, not with society, but with himself. Every day he walked on a knife edge, knowing that he could do no wrong. He saw his best friends end up in jail, their lives ruined for the slightest mistake, for a moment when they were looked at the wrong way, for a word that might not be liked by someone who lacked power, and all these little violations piled up, creating a frightening picture in which there was no room for truth. In this world, Jamal had to be someone else, someone tougher to survive. He himself had become part of the system he had been trying to escape for so long. At some point, Jamal realized that he had to make a choice. Live by the rules of those around him or become part of what was being imposed on him. His outlook on life was shaped by this constant pressure, where racism was not just a word but a daily reality. His place in this world had been predicted from the beginning, and none of his attempts to escape it had been successful. He remembered as a young boy, when he was caught shoplifting with a friend, the police officer didn't even try to listen to an explanation. He had only seen contempt in their eyes because they were black, and even if he wasn't guilty, his skin was already passing judgment. When he was a teenager, his life had been another test, a choice between being what others expected him to be or remaining himself despite the consequences. But every time he took a step forward, the system burned him out without giving him a chance for relief. He could have been a hero to his neighborhood, but the system made him a criminal. All these years, Jamal felt that one day he would face this face, the face of racism, that would not just look for an excuse to condemn him, but would look for his very essence, only to destroy it. Jamal was forced into hiding, balancing between two worlds. A world where he was seen as a threat, and a world where he couldn't show his vulnerability because it could be fatal to him. He was used to it. He was used to the fact that every day his life could end on someone else's whim, on someone else's unreasonable decision, just because he was born in that body. But, despite that, he kept fighting. And now, sitting in this room with the door closed, surrounded by police officers who thought he was part of a criminal network, Jamal began to remember how he had ended up here. He realized that his life was not only a struggle with the system, but also a struggle with himself. He was forced to be something he wasn't, and always had to choose between following the path of a criminal or becoming a part of something that seemed impossible. In a world where any mistakes could cost lives, Jamal had become part of the world he had always tried to avoid. But now he was left with no choice. He was tied to those who engaged in crime, not because he wanted to, but because the system forced him to be part of this game. He remembered how, while trying to get out of this world, he had started working with people who could help him. He knew they weren't honest, but they were the ones who could give him a chance at survival. Jamal always believed that, despite everything, he could be something more. He dreamed of being someone who didn't depend on other people's opinions and other people's preconceived notions. But every step forward, every trust he gave to people became a reason for new mistakes. And now, finally, he was in this room. His life was on the line again, and he felt himself being dragged into the damned wheel. He knew that Johnson and all those who held his views had already made a decision. But it wasn't just a decision that he was a criminal. It was a decision about who he was, who he should be, and who he would be made to be. Jamal was standing on a knife edge, and he could feel every choice he made narrowing as his past tried to destroy his present. But even in this moment, despite everything, he kept his resolve. Because he knew, in a world where every mistake could be fatal, he had to fight for his life, for his truth. When news of Jamal's arrest spread through the neighborhood, the atmosphere became so thick you could cut it with a knife. In these neighborhoods, where every event received a loud response, his arrest was no exception. People standing on the street corners stopped, discussing details they couldn't know for sure but which already seemed obvious. His face, his skin, his past all became the center of the discussion, turning him into a symbol of everything they hated. Soon, his name was on everyone's lips. He became more than just a suspect. He became a character upon whom all the fears and preconceptions accumulated over decades were projected. Neighborhood residents didn't question what really happened, but simply took it as proof that people like him were always involved in crime. Jamal became an example to those who couldn't or wouldn't realize that there was more to his life than just black skin and poverty. His arrest was not just another moment of justice. It was an act of social repression, where the deciding factor was not guilt, but belonging to a certain group. Things were even worse in police circles. If, in the neighborhood, he was already accused by everyone, in the eyes of the law, Jamal was much more than a suspect. To them, his presence in the warehouse was like proof of his guilt. Even if there wasn't any direct evidence, they saw him as a typical criminal. In their eyes, he was not a man who could be wrong or who could be innocent. He was just another black guy from a poor neighborhood, and that was enough to doom him. On the street, conversations began. Some claimed that his arrest was long overdue. Others pitied him, but these were the few who believed in the possibility of justice. Jamal's eyes were viewed with suspicion. and he was showered with ill will on the streets. He became part of an endless chain of racial stereotypes in which his identity and history did not matter. His arrest became a podium for speech, a place where every word of racism resounded louder than all the evidence. They spoke of him as a criminal even before the trial unfolded. Residents of the neighborhood, many of whom had long ago lost faith in justice, discussed how Jamal could have been involved in the crimes. Even those who knew him couldn't help but notice how quickly the perception of him had changed. He was still the same Jamal, but now, after his arrest, he had become a symbol of everything the community disliked. His mistake, his face, his past, it became a reflection of everything they were trying to hide. "It's no surprise," said one of the neighbors, standing outside the store, pulling his hat off his head and grabbing a pack of cigarettes. "We all knew this would happen someday. People like him always get into it." "He didn't even try to hide," the other said. "He thought he wouldn't get caught, and now look how it ends." Jamal listened to them from his small cell, knowing that their words were not just gossip, but the reality in which he was forced to exist. He couldn't prove his innocence or show who he really was, because his appearance was already a decision. His skin said everything for him, even if he hadn't committed a crime. It was simply as a fact, as an inevitability. In his society, he was already a criminal. All that had to be done was to find the evidence that would prove it. Every day, every look he caught from people was like a hammer blow. He felt a dense wall of condemnation growing around his name, impossible to break down. It wasn't even a matter of guilt. It was a matter of his existence in this world, a world where his race was a sentence. And with each day he spent in the cage, that moment became more and more strongly felt, the moment when he was simply blamed for being himself. But even worse was the fact that those who were around, those who were following his case, could do only one thing: give their verdict without seeing him as a human being. To them, Jamal was a symbol of all those social problems they didn't want to recognize. He was the epitome of poverty, crime, and what they considered wrong. And it didn't matter whether he was guilty or not. As Jamal sat in his cage, knowing that his name had become a symbol of animosity and discord, he began to realize that his case was more than just his personal tragedy. It was a case in which racial stereotypes, tensions, and fear collided, and his life, his struggle, his silence became a weapon in this unequal struggle. His arrest, his fate, became a new milestone in an endless chain of struggles for justice where his real guilt did not matter. Jamal sat in the hard metal chair, his hands clenched into fists, but he couldn't hide the trembling. The pressure was getting stronger by the minute, and he knew this wasn't just an interrogation. It was more than that. It was a battle of attrition, and with every word Johnson said, every gesture and look, his resistance grew weaker. But he was too proud to give up. Johnson entered the room like Satan himself, ready to destroy whatever was left of Jamal. He wasn't just a cop. He was the embodiment of everything Jamal hated about this system that was built on racism and bias. Johnson wasn't just a detective. He was a man for whom Jamal was guilty for the sole reason that he was black. "So, you still don't want to talk?" Johnson said, his voice full of contempt. He held back a smile, enjoying the way Jamal was struggling with himself. "You think this is going to end if you just stay quiet? You think your silence will make a difference? I'll tell you what's going to happen. You're going to sit there until you admit you're guilty. You'll do nothing but make things worse for yourself." Jamal didn't answer. He knew that every answer he gave only strengthened Johnson's conviction that he was hiding something. He was already part of this nightmare. He was bound to these walls not only physically, but psychologically as well. And the more he kept silent, the more this pressure was felt. Johnson didn't give up. He was sure he could break Jamal. He was ready to do anything to get recognition, even if it meant breaking his inner world. "You know, I know who you really are, right?" Johnson leaned closer, his face only a few centimeters from Jamal's. "You're just like everyone else. You're someone just waiting to hide behind false excuses. You think if you keep quiet, I'll believe you? No, man, you're a criminal. Just because you are. You were born that way." His words were not mere insults. They were knives stabbing into the soul, creating wounds that could not be seen, but could not be healed. Jamal heard it every day of his life. He heard it from people, from police officers, from those who looked at him as a threat without questioning why he turned out the way he did. It was part of that game in which every black man was guilty beforehand. But despite all these words, Jamal couldn't allow himself to give up. He knew that if he confessed, everything he did would be doomed to be repeated. He would be further proof that they were right, and he was just another criminal. "You want me to believe you're innocent?" Johnson continued, keeping his hand on the table as if trapping Jamal. "You probably think this game is over as soon as you say you didn't do anything. But all these stories about your purity don't interest me. You're just another nigga who's gonna get caught doing something else, and I don't care what you look like or what you say. I've already decided you're guilty. You dug this hole for yourself." Johnson's voice grew more and more ominous, and Jamal felt his nervous system crumbling, but not broken. He tried not to look into Johnson's eyes, trying to avoid a direct stare, but his breathing became increasingly labored and his body filled with terror at what was happening. He knew he would continue to fight, but he also realized that this fight was unlikely to be won. In a way, he had already lost because he wasn't being given a chance. His racial identity was his verdict. "Have you always been like this, Jamal?" Johnson continued. "Or did you learn to be like this? You know, we all know how people like you act. You come into this world and immediately there's a struggle. You're always the loser, always under suspicion. There's no room for truth in your life, only crime. And no matter what you do, we will look at you as a criminal, even if you swear you stand before us with clean hands." Jamal felt his insides clench with pain. He knew that to Johnson his existence didn't matter, that his life didn't matter. He was just another character to be destroyed. This was not an interrogation. This was a test from which there was no getting out alive. Jamal realized that he wasn't going to win this game. His racial identity had already made him guilty, and confessing would be just another lie that would drag him into an endless circle. But his silence, though it wore him down, was his strength. Johnson could humiliate him, threaten him, try to destroy him, but Jamal couldn't allow himself to break. He knew that if he admitted it, his life would only be a continuation of what had long been destined for people like him. He couldn't allow himself to become part of it, because that would be a betrayal of himself, of his life, of his history. There was silence in the room. Johnson kept looking at Jamal, expecting him to give up, but Jamal didn't look him in the eye. His heart was beating steady, his breathing slow. He knew his silence was all he had left, and it was his weapon in this fight, even if it couldn't win the war. But Johnson didn't give up. He kept trying to break him, kept looking for a vulnerability that would break him. And Jamal knew it wouldn't end quickly. It would continue, until they saw in him what they wanted. Each day he spent in the cell pressed Jamal harder and harder. He didn't know what was worse: Johnson's brutal interrogations, full of humiliation and threats, or the growing fear that haunted him with every moment he spent in that dark place. The walls of his confinement seemed to shrink, consuming him, robbing him of even the last shreds of hope. But worst of all, he felt like his life had become part of a game he couldn't fully understand. All his actions, all his silence, his resistance, all of it was becoming part of a larger chess game in which he was a pawn. When Jamal had no idea how far this would go, the investigation had seemed simple. He'd been arrested on suspicion of theft, and now his fate depended on finding any evidence linking him to the crime. But with every new interrogation, with every new look, with every word the police officers said, he began to realize this wasn't just a theft case. This was something much darker and more frightening. All those antique jewelry that was found in his apartment, the books, the photos with people who appeared to be connected to major criminal gangs, they began to unravel a whole different tangle. It wasn't just Jamal's bad choices. He had become part of something far more dangerous. The underworld that these items connected him to was much closer than he could have imagined. The investigation process became incredibly complex and confusing. The police, who did not share Johnson's views, began to discover new details that had previously been hidden. With each piece of evidence found, it became clear that Jamal was not just a pawn in the game, but part of a much larger network. Someone high up, someone powerful, had a vested interest in seeing this story unfold in this particular scenario. Jamal was just a link, a tool in a much more violent and complex game. Just when it looked like the investigation was heading toward a dead end, an unexpected twist appeared. Mason, one of the few police officers who still had doubts about Jamal, discovered information that would change everything. The documents found in Jamal's apartment belonged to more than just criminal gangs, as initially thought. Some of them pointed to connections to higher circles, people whose names he had heard but never thought they might be involved. They were major financial tycoons, powerful political figures who were seemingly beyond the reach of the law. Mason began to investigate these connections, and it soon became clear that Jamal's photographs with criminal authorities were not accidental. He was familiar with them, but not as a participant in their affairs, but as a pawn used by them. The jewelry and books found in his apartment were part of a larger scheme, a scheme that encompassed entire cities kept in the shadows, hiding money, power, and violence. These people Jamal was connected to left him no choice. He had become part of their network by mistake, or perhaps because he was too vulnerable to avoid it. Either way, his life was not his own now. The influence of these men in police and government circles was staggering. Those behind his fate were not just criminals, but masters of manipulation, skillfully hiding their activities behind a facade of prosperity and legality. And now Jamal found himself at the center of this terrifying maelstrom, not knowing which of those around him were friends and which were enemies. Throughout the investigation, Johnson, as before, tried to ignore this new evidence. He was convinced that Jamal was simply a criminal, initially guilty only for the reason that he was black. But even his own colleagues were beginning to doubt his assessment. Johnson couldn't believe that his charge had become part of something much bigger. He continued his aggressive questioning, not realizing that his victim was just the tip of an iceberg hiding something far more devastating underneath. But Jamal didn't have time to think about how deep this network went. He realized that he was part of a terrible game that had gone from fighting the local police to fighting forces that could not be defeated by conventional resistance. He was alone against the system, against people who could destroy him, and that was far more terrifying than any prison. He realized that his future now depended not on whether he would admit guilt, but on how far he was willing to go to survive in this world of intrigue, betrayal, and violence. Jamal had become a pawn not only in the eyes of the police, but also in the eyes of those who really ran it all, and now his life depended on how far he was willing to fight for his freedom, even if he had to face the real monsters lurking in the shadows. Jamal sat in his cell, leaning his head against the cold wall, his eyes closed, but his thoughts kept him awake. He knew that time was running out, that his chance of freedom was fading with every interrogation, with every look, with every word spoken behind his back. He kept trying to find a way out, but he knew he couldn't win this fight. The system was too cruel, and against it he was just an unwinnable pawn. It wasn't just a case, it wasn't just an accusation. It was a life cut short just because his skin was dark. He tried to speak, tried to explain that all his actions were not a crime, but a necessity to survive in conditions that gave him no other choice. But his words did not reach those who decided his fate. To them, he was a black man, and that was all his fault. The racism behind the mask of justice was what destroyed his future. He was guilty because he was born the way he was, and that became obvious to him with every interrogation, with every look, with every new piece of evidence that tied him to the case, even if it had nothing to do with the truth. Mason and Jenkins, the few police officers who were looking for answers and trying to understand what was behind the case, began to realize that Jamal was part of a much darker and more powerful network. But they couldn't exonerate him from the charges. Johnson, confident that he was right, continued to fuel hatred and fear by going after Jamal. He saw him simply as a criminal whose punishment was inevitable. Johnson failed to notice how deeply his beliefs were infused with racism, how easily he sacrificed the truth for his own prejudiced views. Jamal had already been found guilty in the eyes of the police, the community, and Johnson himself, despite all the evidence of his innocence. With each day in prison, Jamal grew weaker and weaker. He saw the other prisoners looking at him with contempt, knowing that his life in their eyes was just a waste of time, another example of how people like him couldn't escape the trap the system itself had created for them. But what was worse was that Jamal realized there were no winners in this fight. His accusation was just another page in a long history where every black man was prejudged, and no one could exonerate him. The trial was short, as expected. In court, where Jamal finally faced the judicial system, his defense was weak and the prosecution was adamant. He could not fight what had been predetermined in advance. The public in the courtroom had already made up their minds beforehand, and in the eyes of the jury, his guilt was obvious. His race was their verdict, and despite the best efforts of his attorney, it was enough to send him to prison for years to come. In their eyes, his life was worth nothing. He was just part of a bigger problem, and his life didn't matter. When the sentence was pronounced, Jamal felt his heart clench. He wasn't surprised, but it didn't make his pain any less intense. He knew that his life was ruined not because of what he had done, but because of who he was. This system didn't give him a chance. It was built on racial stereotypes and social barriers that had long been part of its foundation. And yet, despite his admission of guilt in the eyes of society, Jamal continued to struggle. He tried to maintain his identity, his humanity, in a world where he was being turned into a criminal, even though he had never committed a crime. He tried to find inner strength, but each day in prison was a new challenge, each step along a path that grew darker and more hopeless. His hope died slowly, and racism, violence, and prejudice became his only companions. In the prison where he ended up, Jamal was just another example of how the system breaks lives without thinking of the consequences. He was just another prisoner to them, another number in the statistics, and his tragic fate was no exception. He became part of something he couldn't change. And in the end, his death, like his life, was just another loss to a system that never realized that it was destroying not only him, but entire lives of people trapped in their own bodies. There was a spark of resistance in his eyes until the very end, but that spark could not break through the dark walls built around him. Jamal was trapped in a situation where his racial identity became his strongest enemy. His tragedy was not unique. It was part of a larger problem that continued to destroy the lives of millions of people invisible to society. And his story, unfortunately, ended as so many others end, in a maze of bias and violence, where justice was only a utopia and struggle was a tragedy lost in time. What do you think of this story? Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you had any incidents of racism in your life? Your opinions and stories are very important to us, and we sincerely appreciate each and every one of you. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to subscribe and give us a like so you don't miss new stories. We wish you a good day.